Welcome to Melrose Unitarian Universalist Church. Our service today is called Rebels, Prophets, Social Innovators, Revisiting the Transcendentalists. So, good morning. Good morning. I'm the Reverend Dr. Suzanne Intriligator. My pronouns are she and hers, and I am delighted to see so many people here on this beautiful, crisp autumn day. We are a church of open minds, loving hearts, and helping hands, and anyone who shares our values is welcome to join us today. We gather in the midst of sadness and some anxious times in our world. Today we will pray and meditate, share our joys and sorrows together, and we will remind one another to choose love. Later today, our neighbors at Temple Beth Shalom are holding a memorial gathering at 4 p.m. Our community is invited to join them. I have a few other brief announcements. Free copies of this excellent book, which I preached about a couple of weeks ago when I was arrested. I've ordered a bunch of free copies of this book. I think it's really important. It's the first book that I'm aware of by a clinical psychologist who really talks about our feelings about climate change and how we can find hope and courage, transform ourselves. So this is available to you for free in the church library. There's also copies in coffee hour today. Please help yourself. Please read it, and we will discuss. There are 2 new monthly covenant groups starting this week. One will begin right after church, 12 to 1:30 today. I will be leading it in the library. Drop-ins are welcome to this group, so just come and join us as you like. We'll be talking and sharing about October's theme. And you can also sign up for Katie's Thursday lunchtime group through the midweek update link. I also want to give everyone a really special invitation to next Sunday's service. It's going to be really special. As many of you know, next weekend, 19 of us have signed up to do the Jubilee 3 anti-racism training, which is fantastic, and it includes me. And to give myself a little bit of a break, I've booked a very special guest preacher for next Sunday. He is the Reverend Dr. Kevin Peterson, who is a public theologian who is affiliated with the Anti-Racist Research Center at Boston University. He's also the founder of the New Democracy Coalition, which is a public theology group of interfaith clergy across Boston who have been working for 5 years now to get the city to rename Faneuil Hall and to open a much larger conversation about reparations and Boston's role in the slave trade. There was, in the Sunday Globe, there was a cover story about this whole movement a couple weeks ago. I'll be sharing the link around again this week if you missed it. In that story, there's lots of pictures of Kevin and his good friend, Reverend John Gibbons, who is just retired after 30 years at the UU Church in Bedford. John will also be joining Kevin next week. Another special treat is that Alistair MUUC will be doing the music next Sunday. And he's going to debut a new song that he thinks really goes for the occasion. So it'll be a special highlight to our Jubilee 3 training and a really great Sunday. So come along, please, and bring a friend if you like. Now, we have one more announcement today from Jim Duncan, who sits on our Personnel Committee and also on our Committee on Ministry. Thank you, Jim.
Good morning. My name is Jim Duncan. I'm a member of the Committee on Ministry and also a member of the Personnel Committee. And I'd like to share with you an announcement this morning about Reverend Suzanne's sabbatical. Reverend Suzanne is now in her 6th year of ministry. On May 20th, 2018, many of us were here in the sanctuary to vote to call Reverend Suzanne to be our settled minister. On that day, we presented Reverend Suzanne with our first MUUC contract. In that contract, as in most UU minister contracts, we agreed to provide sabbatical leave for our minister. Sabbatical leave accrues at the rate of 1 month for every year of service, with leave to be taken after 4 years and before 7 years of service. During the sabbatical, we continue to pay full salary and provide benefits. MUUC has been setting funds aside each year since 2018 to prepare for this sabbatical. A sabbatical provides a period of refreshment and renewal for both the minister and the congregation. For the minister, it is a time for study, education, meditation, writing, and other forms of professional and personal growth. It's time for Reverend Suzanne to take sabbatical leave. After doing a great job of helping us to navigate through the pandemic, now is the time for a sabbatical. The Committee on Ministry fully supports this, and we have been encouraging Reverend Suzanne to move ahead with this. And we are pleased to report that it will be happening soon. Reverend Suzanne will be taking sabbatical leave for 3 months, from January 1st, 2024 to March 31st, 2024. Although Reverend Suzanne is eligible for more than that, she feels that 3 months is the right amount of time. She'll return in April. The board has voted to hire a half-time sabbatical minister to fill in while Reverend Suzanne is on leave. This minister will primarily be responsible for Sunday worship services. They will be here in person for 2 worship services a month, and they will work with the staff, the worship committee, and the volunteers to organize the worship services that they will not be doing in person. They will also meet and work with the staff during the week and carry out as many duties as are needed to keep the church running smoothly. But please keep in mind that this is a half-time position, roughly 20 hours per week, so they will not be able to do all the things that Reverend Suzanne does. So there may be opportunities for members of the congregation to help out during the sabbatical, so please stay tuned. Also, Reverend Jay Libby will be available if needed during the sabbatical for pastoral care. The Personnel Committee and the Committee on Ministry members are currently actively involved in conducting interviews for the sabbatical minister position. We will provide updates soon. The Committee on Ministry, whose members are Erin Hoban-Odette, Barbara Lambiaso, and myself, will be available throughout the sabbatical for any questions and for assistance in all matters concerning this. I'd like to thank the Personnel Committee members, Michael O'Connor and Jane Foley, and the Committee on Ministry members again, Erin, Barbara, and also Reverend Suzanne, who is also on the Committee on Ministry, for all their work on this and for the work yet to come. If you have any questions or you want to talk about this some more, I will be available during coffee hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And now on to today's service. I want to thank our helpers, our usher, Mary Beth Griscom, our greeter, Kathy Sang, and our coffee hosts, Catherine and Mary Ellen. Thank you so much. Our theme in worship and RE for the month of October is heritage. And in today's service, we will refresh our acquaintance with some of our most inspiring religious ancestors, members of that 19th century spin-off group who spun off from Unitarianism called the Transcendentalists. So, in that vein, did you know that I once wanted to live like a Transcendentalist? I was going to give away all of my possessions and go and live in a tiny cabin next to Walden Pond for 2 years. But I didn't, because my dad told me that I would be throwing my life away. Yeah, I know, that was a groaner, right? That's good. Okay, now let us welcome one another to worship this morning. Turn, wave, throw hugs, shake hands, say hi to the people on Zoom. Good morning, Zoomers. You're looking good today. Hello, hello, hello. Thank you for the waves. Don't throw your life away. Okay, thank you so much. I call us to worship this morning with these words from the Unitarian minister turned philosopher and essayist, Ralph Waldo Emerson. He writes, "We have a great deal more kindness than is ever spoken. The whole human family is bathed with an element of love like a fine ether. How many persons we meet in houses whom we scarcely speak to, whom yet we honor and who honor us. How many we see in the street or sit with in church, whom, though silently, we warmly rejoice to be with. Read the language of those wandering eye beams. The heart knoweth. Now we light the symbol of our faith, the flaming chalice. Here to light it for us this morning is our board member, Janice Bissix. Thanks, Janice.
Good morning. I invite you to rise in body or in spirit and join me in the words of our covenant, which you can see on the screen. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. This is our great covenant, one with another and with our God.
If everybody would please remain standing and join in our opening hymn, very fitting for this week in the world, I believe. It's number 159 in the gray hymnal. This is my song. Words will appear here. Please be seated.
Our story today is Henry David Thoreau and the Still Small Voice from Sing to the Power, a Tapestry of Faith curriculum by Lynn Unger. The photo illustrations are from Unsplash. Henry sat in front of his little cabin on one of his 3 chairs, listening to the evening. If you were there, you might have thought there was nothing to listen to. Certainly no television or iPod. Those wouldn't be around for 100 years or more. There was no one to talk with, no airplanes overhead, no radio coming from next door. Mr. Emerson's house, the closest thing to a next-door neighbor, was over a mile away. Not that he had a radio to play in any case. Even the natural world was still. No wind rippled the pond, and the birds had stopped singing as night approached. Still, Henry listened for the tiniest sounds: a small fish breaking the surface of the water and splashing down again, the crackle of leaves as a mouse passed by, the sound of wings as a crow passed overhead. To him, these miniature sounds were music. Of course, most of the townspeople thought Henry David Thoreau was crazy when he decided to build a tiny cabin from used materials out in Emerson's wood lot by Walden Pond. Why would a promising writer want to move away from society to sit with birds and bugs for company? In fact, Henry enjoyed the company of Emerson and the other thinkers who shared his Transcendentalist philosophy. However, to him, the quiet of the pond and the animals and plants that lived in and around it provided excellent company. Sometimes, Henry thought, the conversation you learn the most from is the one in which the least is said. As he watched the last rays of light glisten on the pond, Henry thought about the biblical story about the prophet Elijah, who crawled off to a mountain cave to listen for what God wanted him to do. While Elijah stood outside his cave, a great wind whipped the mountains, sending boulders crashing down to the ground in the fury of its passing. But God wasn't in the wind. Then an earthquake rattled the mountain with a terrific rumbling, but God wasn't in the earthquake. Then came a fire sweeping across the rocks and brush outside the cave, red and roaring and grand, but God wasn't in the fire either. Finally, after all the roaring and crashing, everything became quiet. Elijah stood there shaking, wrapped in his cloak, just waiting. And out of the silence came the still, small voice of his God. I'm not at all sure, thought Henry, that I believe that God of the Bible, the one who chatted with Elijah. But whatever God is, I'm pretty sure I know it better out here in the quiet than I would through any ranting sermon. Maybe God is speaking to me in the small voice of the jumping fish and the rustling leaves, the still pond and the stars beginning to peek through the trees. Maybe I hear God when my heart is still and I can listen with my very smallest inner ear. Maybe. And his thoughts drifted off with a small breeze that came and ruffled his hair and rippled across the quiet pond. All right. Thank you all so much for listening. Children who would like to come down to RE can come with me. Thank you.
Every Sunday in the center of our worship, we take time for quiet, to center ourselves, to relax and ground ourselves in our highest ideals, our own sense of what is holy. So I invite you now to sink into your seat, feel your feet on the floor, feel your body relax, and breathe deeply. In this meditation time together, first we'll join in our centering song, and then we sit for a few minutes of shared quiet. Then we speak to one another about our joys and sorrows, and then I will lead a prayer. Our centering song for the month is Heritage. Our theme is Heritage, and our centering song is We Are Not Our Own, verses 1 and 2. It's number 317 in the gray hymnal, but lyrics will appear on the screen. Let the song gently guide you into our time of shared quiet. It is our tradition to share with one another our joys and sorrows, the personal milestones of our lives. This sharing helps us to get to know one another better and to companion one another better on this journey through life. I invite anyone who has a sorrow to share to come forward, please, and speak at the mic so everyone can hear you and see you. I invite people on Zoom to go ahead and type into the chat box, and I will read your sorrows aloud.
I'm Beth Uregrau, and this candle of concern is for the people that are affected by the Israeli-Hamas war. And these people include my son-in-law, who's been with us for 13 years, and his parents have moved from their apartment in Tel Aviv to move in with his brother, wife, and 3 very young children living very near the Gaza border. They wanted to be together. And to my son-in-law's army unit who is gone in to fight. And Yogi is very distraught and feeling quite helpless. So to all of you who share this concern.
Thank you, Beth. And his name is Yogi, right? Let's keep Yogi in our thoughts. No sorrows in our Zoom room. Mary Beth, if you'd go ahead and light a candle for all the sorrows, both spoken and unspoken, that are weighing our hearts down this morning. May we find some peace and some strength and some comfort from one another. And may the candle remind us to reach out to those who are hurting in our lives with support and love. I invite anyone who has a joy to share this morning to go ahead and come forward, speak from the mic. People on Zoom can type in the chat box.
Hi, I'm Maddie Diab. I'm new to Melrose, and I've been frequent to the...
I think we can't hear you. Could you get a little closer?
Sorry.
It's not a great mic, thanks.
I'm Maddie Diab. I'm new to Melrose, and I'm frequent to the Unitarian Church in many communities. I want to express the sorrow of the many Israelis and Palestinians who have been praying and wishing for peace for such a long time, but have not been able to get it so far. And I hope that Israelis and Palestinians will be able to get to peace without losing their faith.
We pray with you. Thank you, and welcome to Melrose.
I'm Beth Uregrau again, still Beth Uregrau, and last weekend was filled with joy and the concern of the war. The joy was after 3 years and 5 months, we were finally able to get my extended family together to celebrate my father's most splendid life. And we had a beautiful ceremony. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. There is a joy in the Zoom room from Amy Cooper Ailes. Good news about Caroline, the woman from Cameroon who lived with us for a while. She just passed her driver's license test, which will give her more freedom and is a great step forward for her. She wanted me to let you all know her happy news. Hooray for Caroline. Mary Beth, would you please go ahead and light this other candle for all the joys that were spoken and those that remain unspoken in our hearts. Let the candle be a reminder to us to know and express the gratitude we feel for the many, many blessings in our lives. Thank you, Mary Beth. Ooh, late-breaking joy from Dan Franklin. Joy for my sister and her husband from England. He has finally qualified for permanent residency in the U.S. Thank you, Dan. I have a prayer for us this morning, if you would please join me in the spirit of prayer. These words were written just this past week by the Reverend Drew Patton, Associate Pastor for Justice and Outreach at First Presbyterian Church of Berkeley. He writes, "If ever they ask you, which side are you on? Tell them plainly, I side with the people. With the precious ones, all, the integral, the soft and the fierce, irreplaceable, the beloved, if only by God and trees, who were born, who breathe and survive. Say, I side with those who keep watch beneath the bright, screaming arc of bombs, with those who hide in dark doorways, or who through the moonlight flee, with those who stay and fight, and with those kept up all night by hunger and grief and terror and rage, by desperate, unruly hope, who are good and green at the root, who are more than the worst that they've done, who do their best to love and still pass on the hurt in themselves that they hate. But what when they take sides against each other, the people against even themselves? Side with whatever is human in them, what is fragile and feeling and flesh. Side with the truth of our stories. Side with the fact of our pain. Side with defiant insistence on freedom. Side there again and again. Side there today and tomorrow. Side there the rest of your life. Side there together until we belong each one to every other. If they ever ask you, which side are you on, say, it doesn't work like that. Tell them you side with the people and abide where the people are at. Amen.
Now is the time for our offertory. Our church is a self-supporting organization funded by your generous annual pledge. You may also contribute to our weekly collection plate, which we split every month with a deserving cause. Folks on Zoom can donate either way using the orange button at the top right corner of our homepage at melroseuu.org. For the month of October, at the request of our recently rebooted fellowship committee, this church will be giving half our collection plate to a social enterprise called More Than Words. With an online store for books and gifts and 2 brick-and-mortar locations, More Than Words provides support and paying jobs to Boston area young people who have been involved in the court and foster systems. Our offertory selection for today is I Choose Love by Mark Miller.
In the midst of pain,
Thank you. For our reading today, I've chosen a responsive reading, which we don't often do here, but it's from Emerson's great essay, The Oversoul. I'll start with the bold sections, and if you wish, you can join in by responding with the italicized portions. It'll appear up on the screen here in just a second. So, Emerson wrote, "Let us learn the revelation of all nature and thought, that the highest dwells within us, that the sources of nature are in our own minds. As there is no screen or ceiling between our heads and the infinite heavens, so there is no bar or wall in the soul where we, the effect, cease, and God, the cause, begins. I am constrained every moment to acknowledge a higher origin for events than the will I call mine. There is deep power in which we exist and whose beatitude is accessible to us. Every moment when the individual feels invaded by it is memorable. It comes to the lowly and simple. It comes to whosoever would put off what is foreign and proud. It comes as insight. It comes as serenity and grandeur. The soul's health consists in the fullness of its reception. Forever and ever, the influx of this better and more universal self is new and unsearchable. Within us is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. When it breaks through our intellect, it is genius. When it breaks through our will, it is virtue. When it flows through our affections, it is love. Thank you. So, when you need comfort or inspiration, where do you turn? Do you have a spiritual hero? Someone whose life helps you understand your own better? Someone who guides you in making moral choices? If not, maybe this sermon can help you out a little bit. So, 7 or 8 years ago now, when I was working at Fallen Church in Lexington, I became intrigued by stories that I had heard about the church's founder, who was a Unitarian minister and an amateur architect who actually designed the octagonal sanctuary that still stands there. I began researching him, pulling old books out of the library, and it turns out at the very same time, also researching Charles Fallen, was John Burens, the former president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, and somebody that I knew from my days at Harvard Divinity School. So he and I corresponded, and he sent me a draft of the chapter he was writing about Charles Fallen. What a life he had lived. Charles Fallen was born in 1796 in Germany, and he studied law at the university there, but he got involved with a radical students' league, and radical at the time was, demanding democracy and the right to vote in Germany. But somehow he got implicated in 2 different assassination plots. So he was on the lam, and he goes to Paris, where he meets the Marquis de Lafayette, the same one who sings so well in Hamilton, still alive at this point, and he knows everybody worth knowing in the world, including a lot of people in Boston. Well, after that, Follen has to go to Switzerland to teach for a while, but he ends up getting followed by the police there, and he has to emigrate. He ends up in Boston a few years later, where the other friends of Lafayette get him a teaching job, and eventually a job teaching German at Harvard. Charles Follen is Harvard's first professor of German. And there he does something really important by introducing to all of the great thinkers living in Boston at that time the thoughts of the German Romantics. So German Romanticism is a big intellectual movement there, and at that moment, and Follen is the bridge to Germany from Boston. He also marries Eliza Cabot of the famous and well-connected Cabot family in Boston, and he becomes a close associate of William Ellery Channing, who is the preeminent Unitarian minister of the time. Channing sends Follen to help gather this church of abolitionists in East Lexington. And Follen becomes close to William Lloyd Garrison, the preeminent abolitionist of the time. Follen begins preaching abolition, and, well, more and more happens. But Follen's on a preaching tour down in New York City, and he takes a steamship back across Long Island Sound, back up to Boston for the dedication of Follen Church, which I said he helped design and build. And he's about to preach at the dedication ceremony, but he is on the Long Island Sound on this steamship, coincidentally called the Lexington, which is carrying 200 bales of cotton up to the cotton mills of New England, and they're stacked a little too close to the smokestack. The whole ship erupts in flame, and Charles Follen dies on Long Island Sound at age 44. But he had already done so much in that short life. He never saw the finished building, which is now the oldest standing church in Lexington. But who took his place there and filled in for him for a couple of years? A freelance preacher named Ralph Waldo Emerson. Personally, I loved this history. I found it so interesting because I was working at the church, but I wondered about John Buren's project, taking all this time to reintroduce us to the Transcendentalists. He was working on a book about all the Transcendentalists, Follen among them. And I thought, John, is it really time for us to be resurrecting our reverence for these 19th century thinkers? I mean, really, aren't they dead white guys? And don't we have other things we need to be doing? But I got a free copy of the book, and I gave it my attention in the last year or so. And what John Buren's does here is new. It's not the old reverence for Emerson. I learned so much that I didn't know about him and all the Transcendentalists. There's a new understanding, and it clears up misunderstandings. He paints a new portrait that makes them more accessible to us. And it's the same way that studying our own personal ethnicities and family histories help us to be grounded in our specific human past, to see patterns and take responsibility for our own history. This book helps me to just demystify and humanize these important religious ancestors of ours and see them as human beings with unique and really helpful stories. So specifically today, I want to recognize and recommend the 3 great inventions, in my opinion, of the Transcendentalists. And those 3 inventions are, I don't think it's an overstatement to say, a brand new kind of religion, which we just read about. 2, spiritual community, a new form of spiritual community that knits people together and gives them new strength. And 3, civil disobedience and modern social activism. 3 huge inventions that transformed the 19th century, and I think maybe the 20th and the 21st as well. Is that too much to claim for them? I don't know. Let's think about it. Most of what we know about Emerson, let's say, or the Transcendentalists in general, comes from pop culture or maybe our high school English class. That version of Emerson does a good job estimating his influence and his importance to American culture, but it's also a bit distorted, because it fails to really give us, I think, a full picture of him and his community. Emerson, like his father and his grandfather before him, was a Unitarian minister. He started off in a post at Second Church in downtown Boston. But when he was still young, his wife died at the age of 20, and it sent him into a tailspin. So he went and he traveled Europe for a year. And when he came back, he had kind of a crisis of faith. Still mourning his wife, he began to disagree with the structure and theology of worship at the time, which was still Calvinist and very formal. Emerson wrote in his journal in 1832, quote, "I have sometimes thought that, in order to be a good minister, it was necessary to leave the ministry. The profession is antiquated. In an altered age, we worship in the dead forms of our forefathers." It all came down to communion. He decided he didn't believe in it anymore, and he couldn't perform it. He gave the congregation a choice between continuing with communion or continuing with Emerson. And the congregation chose communion. So Emerson moved on. In a way, it was what he needed, the freedom to be a freelance preacher and a writer. And very soon he wrote his landmark book, Nature. In that same year, 1833, I believe, he gathered together for the first time with 3 other Unitarian ministers to form a club they soon called the Transcendental Club. Why this word transcendental? It means beyond. It asks what transcends what we know. The senses give us material knowledge, but there is more to life than that. What about the spirit within? How do we form language that captures the movement of spirit? That part of humanity that transcends our everyday experience. Together, these transcendentalists created a new reverence for intuition. And it was the shared zeitgeist of the times that Emerson was able to crystallize and expand on. He did it most famously in his Divinity School address of 1938. He said to graduating ministers, "Let me admonish you, first of all, to go alone, to refuse the good models, even those which are sacred in the imagination of men, and dare to love God without mediator or veil. Cast behind you all conformity and acquaint men at first hand with deity. Look to it first and only, that fashion, custom, authority, pleasure, and money are nothing to you, are not bandages over your eyes that you cannot see, but live with the privilege of the immeasurable mind." In that same speech, Emerson discounted biblical miracles and proclaimed that while Jesus was a great man, he was not God. Well, these comments outraged the establishment and the whole Protestant community of Boston, and Emerson was denounced as an atheist and a poisoner of young people's minds. But he made no reply to the critics. He left others to put up a defense, and he was not invited back to speak at Harvard for 30 years. But as you can see from the reading that we shared this morning, Emerson was trying to articulate something really slippery, something so big that very few people had even attempted to articulate it. There is no bar or wall in the soul where we, the effect, and God, the cause, begins. There is a deep power in which we exist and whose blessings are accessible. And then he talks about the soul of the whole, how we are all connected to the universal soul. And when it finds its form in human expression, it's genius and virtue and love. This is transcendent thinking. It's beautiful and unprecedented, a new kind of religion free from dogma and formulation. Emerson, in effect, says the individual is free to experience divinity firsthand. Throw out all those old ideas and formulations. Throw out even the Bible. Throw out thoughts of Jesus. Just go out and experience God with your own self and tell us about it. It's a new form of religion. Maybe for the first time. Now, Emerson thought he had to break away from the Unitarian movement in order to articulate this. But the church eventually did catch up to him, and for 200 years, his ideas have helped to describe our Unitarian faith. It can't be overstated how important that was. But I want to balance it with the second invention that I'd love to talk about today, the second invention of the Transcendentalist, because that is far less well known and almost lost in time, and that's the thing that Buren's holds up so beautifully in his book. We hear in our high school class that, Emerson was the great individualist, that he was about the soul of the individual. And he was in terms of religious expression, but not in terms of life. In fact, Emerson did the opposite. He was a great community builder. He believed very much in connecting with other people. Did you ever wonder why the tiny village of Concord had such a density of famous writers in the 19th century? It's because Emerson gathered them there. He wanted to be surrounded by great minds and interact with them on a daily basis. He coaxed Hawthorne. He helped Bronson Alcott buy the farm where Alcott raised Louisa May and her sisters. He is the one who had owned the land where Emerson built his little cabin next to Walden Pond. Emerson cultivated a sense of community. But in Buren's book, that community is even much wider than even Emerson's circle. It includes most of the clergy in Boston and many of them Unitarians. Buren's book is a portrait of the Transcendentalists as a spiritual community, a group of maybe 20 figures, almost all Unitarians, many of them women, and many of them women's rights activists. They interacted continually, writing, lecturing, reading, corresponding with one another. Their letters are filled with affection. Despite many disagreements and fallings out, they remained a tight-knit group for 20 years. They were not individualists. They were more communitarian. They even spun off 2 different experiments in communal living, both of which only survived a few years. They were utopian communities in Harvard, Massachusetts, and in West Roxbury. At this time, in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, the Boston area was a booming but deeply divided place. Many Unitarians and other Protestants made fortunes from the cotton mills and the garment trade, which relied heavily on slave labor from the South. So prominent churches like Lexington's First Parish, which had already been existent for 50 years at that point, remained silent on the topic of slavery and abolition. And so that's why the farmers in East Lexington formed their own church and called Fallen to lead it, because they were abolitionists. Over time, all of the Transcendentalists in Boston had to come to terms with this issue and formulate and articulate and then defend their own positions on the issue, at times battling with each other, with the public, and with the institutions they worked for, and then eventually battling even with literal armies in the Civil War. This spiritual community gave them both the strength and the support they needed to sustain the abolitionist movement in dark, divided times. And we have so much to learn from them. Which brings me to the third point I want to make. The Transcendentalists invented modern social activism, or at least they contributed to it greatly. First of all, there's Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience. He refused to pay taxes to the government during the Mexican War. But really, the Mexican War was about the expansion of slavery. This was a protest against government policy, and he would not contribute to violence. He only spent 1 night in jail, but he risked spending many more. His essay is about all of our responsibility to refuse unjust laws. And it went on to influence Tolstoy and Gandhi and Martin Luther King, so many other important people of the 20th century. 16 years before Thoreau wrote this, however, Fallen had to choose a path. He was one of the very few abolitionists on the Harvard faculty. I thought about him about a month ago when I had to decide whether or not I wanted to get arrested and bring that question to the church leaders. So I wondered, have you ever had to choose between your moral scruples and your employment? For me, somebody like Charles Fallen is an interesting guide. In 1835, the conservatives had called a meeting at Faneuil Hall. They had denounced Garrison and the Anti-Slavery Society. And Fallen faced a choice to follow him or to lose his job at Harvard. He ended up losing his job, and he struggled for years after that to support his family. I'll end with another story about a Unitarian minister you probably have never heard of, but you should, who was also a Transcendentalist, Thomas Wentworth Higginson. He was initially the minister in Newburyport, but he stirred controversy there by criticizing the poor treatment of workers in the town's cotton mills. Then he joined the County Anti-Slavery Society and invited Emerson and Theodore Parker to speak at his church, and also a fugitive from slavery named William Wells Brown. Well, Higginson was forced to resign soon after that. But then he rallied himself and campaigned for Congress, which he lost. But then he joined the Boston Vigilance Committee, which publicly fought the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And Higginson worked to protect fugitive slaves from pursuit and capture in Boston. In 1854, when an escaped man named Anthony Burns was threatened with extradition to the South, Higginson actually led a small group who stormed the federal courthouse in Boston with battering rams, axes, cleavers, and revolvers in an effort to free Burns and save him from being sent south. They did not succeed. But even after that, Higginson got a job as the minister of the Free Church in Worcester, and he became a fiery advocate for women's rights and workers' rights. And there, he also collected funds and weapons as part of the Secret Six who supported John Brown in his raid on Harper's Ferry. Even after Brown was captured, Higginson tried to raise money for his defense at trial, and he made plans to help him escape from prison. Now, Brown was unsuccessful, and so was Higginson. Other members of the Secret Six fled to Canada or elsewhere, but Higginson never fled, even though everyone knew about his involvement with John Brown. Then, it goes on. Higginson served for 2 years as a captain in the Union infantry in the Civil War. And then he was recruited to lead the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, the first authorized regiment of escaped slaves to fight with the Union Army. The government required such groups to be led by white officers, but Higginson showed uncommon respect to his soldiers. He wrote, "We, their officers, did not go there to teach lessons, but to receive them. There were more than 100 men in the ranks who had voluntarily met more dangers in their escape from slavery than any of my young captains had incurred in all their lives," unquote. I am deeply inspired by these ancestors who lived in a time as difficult and as divided as our own, but yet still managed to invent, to create, to hold true to their values, to risk it all for their moral vision, and to change the world. They were not radical individualists, not misanthropic loners, not dry intellectuals, but committed friends who loved and supported each other, who allowed difference and even dispute, who helped each other to create and hold high religious standards. May we learn and grow by their example. May we strive to be such ancestors to those who come next after us. Amen. Please join me, if you would, in a closing hymn, which evokes all the beautiful images of nature that Emerson would have enjoyed. It's number 163 in the gray hymnal, "For the Earth Forever Turning." Please join me in our chalice extinguishing words. We extinguish the flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. You may be seated. Our worship has ended. Thank you very much for joining in today. Thank you to our friends on Zoom. Please enjoy a brief postlude from Tom, and then join us in the next room over for our coffee hour. People on Zoom can stay in the room and chat with one another. Thank you, and happy Sunday.